the stand that he did. Really up to that point, from the time that he posted the 95 Theses, or really sent the 95 Theses to the various bishops, up until the meeting at the Diet of Worms, so for about 3 years, he was mostly challenging the abusive practice of selling indulgences. That was his big axe to grind. That was his big straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak. He really objected to what John Tetzel, and not just Tetzel, but others were doing in the selling and abusing of indulgences. But along with that was his own personal theological quest, if you will, the torment in his own soul that was not finding rest, if you will, in his studies, and was leading him to question the sacrament, church authority, etc. And it was really his attack on church authority, specifically the papacy, that caused him to break away. And after the Diet of Worms, what you didn't see in the movie was his condemnation and his, what would have eventually had been, his arrest and possibly death. He would have been executed. But what happened is, he was kidnapped, literally kidnapped from Worms by sympathizers and those who were opposed to what they believed were the abuses of Rome, specifically political abuses as far as taxes were concerned. And the princes of Germany hid him from what would have been an execution, which then caused him to basically be in exile. He was in hiding for many years, and during that time he continued to write, and specifically he spent most of that time translating the Bible from Greek into German. And that translation still exists to this day. There are translations, what are called Lutheran translations of the scriptures. And one of the things that it includes was the word only in Romans 1:17, 1:18. The just shall live by faith alone. He added that into his Bible as part of his translation. Well, this helped the movement, as it became known, to grow. There were more and more followers of Luther in the lowlands of Germany that were following him. But he himself was in isolation for fear of the authorities, the political authorities. And so it was his right-hand man, Philip Melanchthon, that really started to promulgate Luther's ideas throughout Germany and garnered for him the following that he did that later became known as Lutheranism. And thus, that's the Protestant revolt from the church. That's what that turned out to be. And it began as one thing, and it ended up another. But I like the way that this movie depicts both his personal torment and how it evolved into this break from the church. So that's one thing I want to go over, because it's well over 500 years that happened. Over 500 years ago, that event occurred. And then I would like to take some time and talk about the Song of Solomon. I want to get us back onto the Song of Solomon. Seems like it's been a while. But also, I want to again reiterate this little calendar, and I will send out an email about this as well. We're meeting obviously today. Next week we will meet as well. November 20th is Thanksgiving week. We will not meet on that Tuesday. If for no other reason, just to give everyone a little break before the holidays. We will resume after that on Tuesday the 27th. We'll continue on December 4th. On December 11th, I will give my famous A Merry Deconstructed Christmas message, where I go through and I talk about our traditions related to Christmas and how it compares to what the scripture says the first Christmas was like. We talk about, when was Jesus born? Was it December 25th? Was it a cold night? Were the wise men there? Now, those of you who have heard it already know what the answers to those questions are. Okay? But those of you who haven't, I'll go over that. And interestingly enough, this week I got in the mail from Catholic Answers. I get their magazine, Catholic Answers magazine. And in it, Jimmy Akins asked this same question. How can we determine when Jesus was born? Or can we determine when Jesus was born? I scanned through the article, and he's got some interesting, interesting arguments to make. But from the little bit that I've read, I'm afraid I can't totally agree with Jimmy on everything on this one. So I'm going to go out on a limb with this one. I'm not sure if he's been as thorough in his research, which he normally is. So I'll have to read the article a little bit more thoroughly, and I'll come back to you on that. December 18th will be our Christmas party, so it's literally a little more than a month away. Christmas, gee, goodness, it just seems like it was Halloween. It just seems like I started school, you know, so anyway. We will have a break from Bible study for 2 weeks because December 25th and January 1st is literally on a Tuesday this year. So we're definitely not meeting for 2 weeks after that. We will resume on January 8th and continue until we finish the Song of Songs. So that's a little preview of what to come. So we meet next week. We don't meet the week after that. We'll meet for 4 times after that, one of which will be our Christmas party. And then we will take a break for another 2 weeks and resume after the new year. 2019. Wow. 2019. I didn't think we'd make it this long, really. We did. It's funny, I talk to my students who are high school students now, and it's interesting how I reflect about what I was thinking of when I was in high school at that time. And I remember the big thing that I was concerned about back then was nuclear war. I really believed that it was a possibility that the United States and the Soviet Union would exchange limited nuclear weapons with one another. That was a big concern of mine. I remember our valedictorian spoke about that at graduation. She reflected on how we wondered if we were going to be around next year. We didn't know. This was 1984 when I graduated. So the Cold War was pretty much was pretty heated up. Reagan was president at that time, I remember that. It was the election of '84, that was the first time I ever voted. That's when I was able to vote for the first time, I remember that. So it's just really interesting to see all of the changes that have occurred since then. My students, their biggest concern, school shootings. They're concerned if some nut is going to come on campus with a gun and what to do about it. So what a difference. I mean, that wasn't something that wasn't even on my radar when I was in high school. You know, Just how times have changed, you know? Interesting, just interesting. So like I said, I will post this, or I will send this around in an email so that everyone will be aware of it, but just note that we will meet next week. So I want to get us started. Those of you who were here last week for Halloween, what did you think of the video that I showed? What did it bring up, if anything, that you would like to, or questions it brought up for you? Yes? Can you say that again? I couldn't hear you. Well, we know from his writings and from his own, like, diaries, if you will, that he was a very troubled soul. He saw God as this implacable judge. He was all holy, he was all good, and he was extremely aware of his own sinfulness and his own limitations. And that is the kind of torment that he went through. How can I, as a sinful man, approach an all-holy God? I have no hope. And part of this, I've read a lot of books about Martin Luther over the years, both when I was an evangelical and then later as a converting Catholic. And one of the things that people have speculated or analyzed about Martin Luther is that this may have come from his own upbringing. What does that mean? That means that his father was a very unloving person. He was very harsh. When Martin Luther was growing up, he was a very harsh man, very unemotional. His marriage to his mother, the marriage that he saw was a very unloving kind of relationship. And so many have speculated that this view is how what he saw in his own father was projected onto God. A very harsh, very unloving kind of God. And that was really quite well done in the movie that was presented. Others that wrote about Martin Luther talked about how he used to wear out his confessors. He would go to confessors almost daily with his sins and found no peace in the sacrament of confession. He found no peace in that because he was constantly thinking about how God couldn't forgive him, how his sins were so great that they were unforgivable. And like, what kind of sins was he doing? And it wasn't anything necessarily that he was doing. It was even mentioned in the movie. What did you do, Brother Martin? And it's like, I'm just a sinner. And God is all holy. And I am not. And that was it. And that kind of torment, and I call it that because it was a torment, is what plagued Martin Luther. It's what drove him to the Augustinians to be a brother, and it drove him to flagellate himself. He used to beat himself, you know, to bring his body, to mortify his body. And he found no peace. That's what was his torment, is that he just simply didn't find peace in his soul. And the more he studied, like it said, very interesting, and as someone who is how do I put it, a fellow intellect, because I do consider Martin Luther quite an intellect. He was no dummy, to be sure. I mean, he had a doctorate in philosophy, in theology. I mean, that was not easily done back in those days. But his intensive study, the more he studied, the more it was in his head. He said, remember that one line? It's in here, and I can speak it out here, but it's not in here. It didn't give him peace of mind or peace of soul. He could spout off all that he learned, but it did not sink into his soul. And I remember being at Biola when I was a young man, and having that same kind of, I can empathize with him. I knew a lot, but it didn't seem to change my life as much as I would have wanted it to. And so I began to question my own salvation. I began to question, was I really a Christian? You know, I would do that a lot. Because it's like, yeah, I accepted Jesus, I did all that, but I still sinned. Why hasn't that changed? I know a lot, but my behavior hasn't changed. And one of the things I've learned as I've matured over the years is that this battle with our flesh is something that we're never going to totally overcome on this side of the grave, this side of eternity. It is something that even the best of saints have always struggled with. Now, they narrow their range of sins, if you will, from this to this by the time they enter heaven, to be sure. But the point is they are always aware. In fact, the saints are the ones that are the most attuned to their sinfulness than we are. What we wouldn't even think twice about, they would be mortified to do. You think, my God, how are we ever going to? You never will this side of eternity. That's part of the struggle. And why is that? Part of that answer, I have learned over the years, is to keep us humble. Because think about it. If there was a point where you said, I made it, I no longer sin, and I'm perfectly holy, don't you wish you were like me? Right? Do you see that? See, right there is a big old sin. What is it?